Good good evening, everyone. I want to thank everyone who's tuned in to this webinar. I began giving webinars only when COVID um, first happened, and so I've given many. I still obviously prefer talking to people live, but this is a very important topic. I was a bit hesitant to to address this topic. I also want to apologize. I'm normally not quite so melodramatic. I'm calling this webinar "The Secrets of UC Admissions That No One Else Will Tell You." I will say it's a pretty honest title. I have in 5 years not heard anyone tell you what I'm going to tell you now. Um, the secondary title is The Trout in the Milk. I'm going to let that remain somewhat mysterious unless you are someone who's read a lot of 19th century literature. It may be an illusion that's not immediately familiar. I'll try to make it not only familiar, but clear. I'm going to try to tell you in the span of about 45 minutes a pretty complicated story about what is happening in UC admissions. Um, Trying to think like a scientist, I'm amenable to recalcitrant data, to pieces of data that maybe undermine what I'm saying. But I will say, in the last 5 years, I'm going to give you a kind of Occam's razor version. I'm giving you the most elegant, linear, simple explanation of what I've seen. But I first need to make sure everyone understands what in the world I'm talking about when I say what I have seen in UC admissions. Um, all right. Let's begin with a little quiz. If you've tuned into any of my other webinars, if you've been paying attention to UC admissions, this might not be such a tricky question, but I want you to consider which one of these students got into UC San Diego in 2022. Now, student one is a 4.4 GPA, a 1590 on the SAT. ISEF means International Science and Engineering Fair. USICO is a Computer Olympiad Award. This is a very impressive award. AME is a very impressive math competition. This young woman is also an international award winner in piano. A Women in Technology nonprofit gave her an award to acknowledge her leadership. And she also, when COVID began, founded a nonprofit that's delivered um, learning and even just kind of fun support to kids all over the world, probably more than 2,000 students. The other student is also a nice young woman. Her GPA is about a 4.1. This person did not take the SAT. She was planning on only applying to the UCs. She did show me a PSAT that was about a 780 out of 1520. Um, she didn't really have any activities to speak of. You can guess, I imagine, from the idiom of this sort of question. The student who got in 2022 was student two. Student one, um, did not get into UC San Diego. UC Riverside accepted her, but told her that she needed to pick a different major. She was offered her second choice major. They explained that computer science, her first choice, was impacted. Student one, before we shed tears for her, she is at MIT. Um, I want you to know I'm going to show you some data, and this is from a common data set that anyone can find that the UCs publish. If you want a link to this, let us know. I'll do my best to provide everyone with the sources of the data I'm showing you. Um, in 2016, 119 Westview High School students were admitted to UC Berkeley, um, or rather applied, and 44% were admitted. Um, what was the admissions rate for Westview students to UC Berkeley in 2021? So 2021 is the first year after the UCs made a major change in admissions. And if you're understanding the logic of these kinds of questions, you'll know the answer is E. Westview went from a 44% acceptance rate to Berkeley to a 6.7% acceptance rate. That is less than 1/6. I'm going to show you some acceptance rates from 2018. This is a year or two before the UCs made a major shift in admissions. The average acceptance to UC San Diego in California was 30.2%. Bonita Vista in Chula Vista had a 37% acceptance rate, and King Chavez, a public charter school in downtown San Diego that I've done some work with, they had a 31.8% acceptance rate. And CCA was 61.3, Westview was 65.5, Del Norte was 60. CCA, Westview, Del Norte, as many of you know, are very, very competitive, very rigorous schools. They produce math Olympiad figures. They produce kids who end up going to the International Science and Engineering Fair. And in 2018, those students were rewarded for doing very well in a rigorous environment. In 2023, these are last year's data for the kids who started in 2024. Bonita Vista jumped to 61%. King Chavez, 57.1% acceptance rate. King Chavez, I should probably tell you, I mean, it's somewhat relevant. They have a absentee rate of 40%. On any given day, about 40% of the students don't show up to school. So it looks like everyone who did show up, 57%, got into UC San Diego last year. CCA dropped to 15%, Westview 13, and Del Norte 11. I would ask you to consider, if you don't know these numbers, why don't you know them if you are familiar with these schools? And if you are a counselor or teacher, I would say you should at the very least know these numbers. And if you're a board member of San Diego Union or Poway Unified, I would hope you'd already be familiar with these numbers. What accounts for Westview's acceptance rate to Berkeley dropping to smaller than 1/6 of what it was a few years ago? Why are MIT students being rejected by most UCs? Why are some students being rejected by nearly all of the UCs, but getting into Ivies? In 2021, I had a student who was accepted to Stanford early. We had a talk. I said, why don't you trim your list? Don't eat all the food on the table. Let's be generous. Your acceptances to Columbia and Cornell and Dartmouth and Brown will hurt your friends who are dreaming of those schools. It is something of a zero-sum game applying to college. He graciously trimmed his list. He got into Yale, Harvard, Princeton, MIT, in addition to Stanford. But Berkeley and UCLA said no. Irvine, Santa Barbara, Davis said no. Cal Poly SLO said no. And San Jose State said no. If you are thinking, well, too bad, but he's going to Stanford, I want you to consider most people who don't get into the UCs did you not have Stanford as their backup. Why is a student who's been featured in news stories lately, who was rejected by all the UCs and Cal States to which he applied, why is he now working for Google? Why are several lawsuits being brought against the UC system? To understand this situation, we need to understand a little history. Admissions in the United States has always been different from admissions in other countries. If you are in China, you take an exam, the Gaokao. If you're in Korea, you take the exam called the Sunong. If you are in England, it's your O levels and A levels. These countries are not weird. The United States is the weird one. It's also, in some ways, I certainly would have said this more confidently a few years ago. The United States is weird, but also wonderful. We have a different educational system in many ways. We have a different method for accepting people. We're looking at human qualities more than just cognitive ones. So we've never really had a purely exam-based system. Around the world, you get in almost entirely by exams. The United States has a much more holistic system, or at least in the UCs, we we did until recently. Um, you need to know that the University of California in the 1960s began to reflect what was called the UC Master Plan. The University of California schools would be at the very top of a three-tiered system, and they would be dedicated to research. And the goal was for them to be West Coast Ivy level schools. That goal has in many ways been attained. The Cal States were meant to be less rigorous and less selective and less focused on research. I would say that goal has been abandoned because research is more profitable for universities. But until very recently, the Cal States were appreciably easier to get into than the UCs. And community colleges largely remain open to everyone. They're not selective or picky. They are meant to be a ladder, a rung that anyone can take a step on. I'm going to praise our system for a moment. We have a system where if you have struggles, challenges when you're 15 or 16, your hopes of college are not over. There are many, many doors that can open for you. There are many ways of getting on the train. This is good. I would never want that to change. Um, but I will talk about some of the changes, especially that are happening in the top two levels. Um, these are the University of California schools, and they're the subject of my conversation with you all tonight. Um, I taught English at UCLA for many years. I arrived there in 1993 as part of a PhD program, and I taught in late 94 all the way to around 2001, 2002, when I was a graduate student and also teaching as an instructor. Um, I not only helped unionize graduate student instructors at UCLA, but I also helped organize civil disobedience um, in response to what was called Prop 209. Prop 209 was meant to eliminate affirmative action. California back then had a points-based system. In the UCs, you got points for SAT, points for difficulty of courses, points for identity, underrepresented, and those points were added up, and you could see what you see you might be likely to get into. In 1996, the voters of California were asked to consider eliminating the notion that affirmative action, admission by race or ethnicity or gender should be a part of the UCs. And I organized civil disobedience. We drew straws to see who would be arrested in Westwood at the intersection of Wilshire and Gailey. A friend of mine was arrested. He went into a police van. He's now a tenured professor at an East Coast university. And I went door to door knocking in certain neighborhoods. I was a Democrat, still am a Democrat, although I've got some weird feelings about that now. Um, Talking to people, explaining why I did not want Prop 209 to pass. But I'll never forget knocking on the door of an apartment in West LA, and a Vietnamese woman wanted to talk about 209. And she asked me questions. Some of her questions I didn't have good answers to. She asked me, would her children benefit from affirmative action or not? The honest answer is no. And she asked me to come out of the foyer, look at her apartment, and she wanted me to see that about nine people lived in a two-bedroom apartment, and she wanted me to know that they had come from Vietnam with almost nothing, and they had just a little bit more than nothing. And she told me she's not going to vote against 209. She's going to vote in favor of it because she wants her students to have a chance. That conversation stuck with me, and when 209 passed, when the UCs were forced to eliminate affirmative action, they took their sweet time. But in 2006, almost 10 years later, they built an admission system that would be called holistic or comprehensive review. And I'm describing it a little bit here, but they looked at many, many, many factors. The point system, they worried, would harm students who've maybe had difficult or more challenging circumstances. And holistic or comprehensive review meant there's no SAT or ACT or GPA that guarantees admissions, unlike earlier. They looked at everything, including life story. I would argue this was the gold standard for college admissions. Um, Starting around 2006, I saw students who had very difficult life circumstances but low scores um, getting into Berkeley. I saw um, a practice that probably people who are deeply conservative didn't like because it wasn't just pure numbers. It was truly holistic. And I was really pretty proud to be in California. And we had in the office in 2016, 17, 18, 19, we had a greater than 80% acceptance rate for our students to Berkeley because we knew that they could work hard and learn grammar, learn vocabulary, become a better reader, fill in the gaps in their math, and do well on tests. We could help them understand how they could do better in their classes, how they could be more organized, how they could build a better study area, build more maturity. And we helped them understand how they could show a spark of leadership, of passion, of curiosity. I help parents understand that your students' interests and passions were not distractions, but were in fact like that's the goal. That's the stuff that you want the UCs to be looking at. Um, Roughly speaking, if you had okay grades and scores, you're going to go to the lower tier. Back then, people understood Riverside was in the lower tier, and the middle tier, Irvine and Santa Barbara, these were only for kids with very good grades and good scores. And you truly had to have great grades and scores to have a chance at the mid tier, top tier UC, San Diego, UCLA, Berkeley. Um, Top grades, top scores, and impact. You created, built, led, you're probably getting into Berkeley and UCLA. Again, more than 80% of our students that we work with for college apps were getting into Berkeley. And if they had top grades and top scores and international impact, they did something truly amazing. Then they're probably going to not only go have the chance to go to Berkeley or UCLA, but they're going to get into Ivy League schools. But I want to make sure everyone knows I would have back then in 2017, 2018, students who would get into Berkeley for EECS, electrical engineering, computer science, get into Harvard and turn down Harvard to go to Berkeley. Why would someone do that? Berkeley is cheaper, and Berkeley, when it comes to computer science, is better than Harvard. That student, I thought, made perfectly rational decision, one that his parents also were happy about. They didn't have to pay for Harvard. UC Berkeley, back in 2017, you could see they had 85,000 applications. And if your GPA was above a 4.0, you're almost 30% likely to get in. You can see if your ACT was strong, didn't have to be perfect, but good, 28% likely. You can see in 2018, more people applied, and the acceptance rate went down in every way. And that was the pattern until 2019. Um, UC San Diego, one could see clearly, transparently is a word we should use, that they had a lot of applicants too, but a higher acceptance rate, almost double. And you could see that it got a little bit harder, but you could infer, you can't see it directly, that if you were good in GPA and you were good um, at scores and you took hard classes, you might be more like 75% likely to get into San Diego. And if you had great leadership and that spark, you're very, very likely. The UCs using holistic admission steadily rose through the ranking. UCLA is back then around number 20 on par with actually a little bit better than Georgetown in the ranking and just a tick below Notre Dame and Cornell. Berkeley, um, Go Bruins was a little behind UCLA. And I would say very importantly, when in 2019, we're asking questions like, what are the most diverse public universities in the United States? 10 of the 15 most diverse public universities in the United States were UCs and Cal States. Um, the UCs built an excellent um, university system that was among the most diverse in the nation. Um, but in 2018, the UC leadership began working toward two efforts um, that ended up being very meaningful. One was the UC regents and the UC leadership began advocating for Proposition 16. It was an effort to reverse Prop 209. Remember, Prop 209 made affirmative action and consideration of race and ethnicity illegal in California, and instead they used holistic, three-dimensional examination of candidates. But the regents and the UC leadership, not the professors, the UC leadership wanted to go back to using race and ethnicity. This is largely because of a kind of encroaching ideological certainty on the part of many people in university administrations that race is um, the primary lens through which we should see other people. The UC leadership also initiated a 2-year study of the SAT and ACT. They were pretty certain that this study would show that these tests are unfair or unhelpful, junk. Um, Actually, neither of these efforts worked as planned. Although the regents unanimously endorsed restoring affirmative action, they said it was going to be a priority. Um, Prop 16 failed at an even greater rate than Prop 209 had passed. Even though California is demonstrably the most liberal, progressive of the 50 states, California voters confirmed they did not want their students, their children, to be seen largely through the lens of race, but rather as individuals. This was a blow. It was a surprise only to UC administration. Every newspaper poll, every person on the street indicated this was not going to pass, but the UCs were utterly shocked and surprised. Uh, the task force that was supposed to look at the SAT and ACT, it also um, offered another surprise for the UC leadership. This is a 200-page summary of the study on the SAT. It's pretty nerdy. I mean, it's not a beach book. It's pretty thick. The study concluded that the SAT and ACT were excellent predictors of who would do well in the UCs, better than grades. Grades they determined were very variable depending on the environment, the community, even the personality of the teacher. Grades and scores together would be the best, but if you had to pick one, probably scores would be better. But of course, most universities don't pick one. They use both together. Holistic admission used both. The study concluded that the SAT and ACT, despite persistent myths and rumors, were abundantly fair. They were actually excellent at identifying talent in under-resourced areas. And um, the study recommended, based on these factors, keeping the SAT. The faculty on the Senate faculty committee in the UCs voted 51-0 to keep using the tests. And this insight that the study arrived at and that UC professors voted on, it would a couple years later, after the chaos of COVID, be endorsed by nearly every selective university. MIT said we're going back to the SAT and ACT to achieve diversity. This distinguished looking woman is the president of Dartmouth. She also made the argument that the SAT and ACT promote not only excellence, but also diversity in Dartmouth. I've got a massive library of literature explaining why the SAT and ACT are probably not what you imagine they are. But of course, the regents decided in their wisdom, as politically appointed final voices in the UCs, that they would first make the tests optional, and then it's a complicated story that I don't have time for, eventually test blind. The UCs do not use the SAT or ACT in admissions decisions, despite their own study suggesting that they should. Um, the regents, this is from LA Times article, the regents voted on affirmative action that they wanted to bring it back. They wanted to kill Prop 209 almost in the same month that they voted to get rid of the SAT and ACT. I want you to consider these are two pieces that are linked in the minds of UC leadership. Um, the regents recognize that they've been talking for years about diversifying their student body. Now, I want you to consider the evidence suggests the UCs and Cal States are the most diverse universities in the United States. Um, and now someone says, now they're finally getting serious about it. In 2020, the UC and Cal States created an entirely new admission system, one that um, I would argue is extremely opaque. It is the opposite of transparent. Um, they told the world that they were going test blind, and they spread some falsehoods. They said they were going test blind because the tests are unfair. That is not what their study revealed. I want you to consider, though, in 2020, the zeitgeist, the fancy German word that means the spirit of the age or time, it made these changes that the UC regents and UC leadership were contemplating. It made them seem not only reasonable, possible, but even urgent. Naomi Klein is a journalist, a writer. I have a copy of this book in my library at home. She wrote a book called The Shock Doctrine, which explained that in the wake of 9/11 and the chaos and fear, the Bush administration used this cultural shock to implement practices and policies that would have been rejected in another moment. So we ended up starting a war in Afghanistan, but also a war in Iraq. Um, she was somewhat farsighted. Even the Pentagon acknowledges that the winner of our 19-year war um, abroad, begun sort of in the wake of this shock of 9/11, was Iran. We can't really find any way the United States profited materially. Um, I would argue 2020 and COVID was another instance, not of a conservative or right-leaning government um, taking away liberties, but in this instance, liberties that um, the political left had been eyeing for a while. I want to remind you that in the midst of COVID, there were editorials written telling us we not only need to free nonviolent inmates in the midst of this threat caused by the virus, but also those locked up for violent crimes. Today, some of the ideas that were considered reasonable in 2020, 2021, we kind of have rethought them. But the UCs made massive, quiet changes to admission. And it frustrates me that I find almost no journalists and very few people in public or private schools not only talking about this, but very few really understand the circumstances. Um, the UC, after losing Prop 16, made very public their commitment to champion diversity. Um, I think very few of us are opposed to the concept of diversity, but you want to consider their notion of diversity is perhaps a bit different than the common sense one. And in the wake of 2020 and these changes, test blind admission, the UC set new records for diversity. They were the most diverse. Now they're even more diverse as they understand it than they were before. But I would say the consequences of this are found throughout California. This is a news story describing a San Francisco Bay Area teenager who was rejected by every UC campus to which he applied and rejected by Cal State's. He had a 4.4 GPA, a 1590 SAT. He created a document signing startup, and he built nonprofits to teach coding to under-resourced kids. I'm going to tell you, because he didn't get into um, any of the super prestigious Ivy level schools either. Um, I haven't met him. I haven't seen his apps, but I'm going to guess if he showed me his application, I probably would have had some suggestions. Um, I don't want to, I want to, this isn't about promoting what we do. It's about telling people what's happening. But I generally can take someone like this and get them into top schools. In some years, 25% of the Harvard acceptances in the counties of Southern California are our students. But in the old days, a student who didn't put things together quite the right way, who maybe wasn't as charismatic as others, there would be a place in the UCs for them. There was no place for this student. So I want you to know the cost of um, this model of diversity itself doesn't recognize the value of this young man. He now works for Google. He is not getting a college education. There are other lawsuits. They are piling up. These lawsuits um, have really been energized in the last couple of months. And I will say, I am not unhappy that these lawsuits are taking place. I am unhappy with other changes I'm seeing in the political landscape. I am a classic liberal. Um, I think we're doing some dumb things as a hyper reaction to some other dumb things. Um, I'm just not a Trump fan, and I think we're doing some desperately dumb things. But I will say, a admission system in California that turns away someone like that young man, that turns away my students who then have to go to MIT or Stanford, that's also not only unfair but dumb. It's hurting California as an economic engine. Um, and NPR here is describing the Supreme Court ruling, which essentially mirrored Prop 209, saying there should be no use of affirmative action of race or gender. But I want you to consider in this past year, after that decision, Yale, Princeton, and Duke, their acceptance rates for Asians dropped further. One could argue, in fact, lawyers are in the midst of arguing Yale, Princeton, and Duke simply thumbed their nose at a Supreme Court ruling. As someone who has, for almost 20 years, attended the National Association of College Admissions Counselors Conference, I would say that's the temperature of the room in the NACAC yearly conference is, bring it on. Um, um, the UCs and many other selective universities are practicing what we might call cynical idealism. They believe in a cause, their version of equity and diversity, so strongly that they believe that the ends justify the means. That's one form of cynicism. Another is that the UCs, by eliminating testing, can also improve, somewhat paradoxically, their ranking by increasing selectivity. Very few observers, other than true insiders, understand that this cynical side of test optional or test blind admissions um, is encouraging what economists call perverse incentives. An example of a perverse incentive is during colonial British India, the British Raj wanted to um, have fewer deaths by cobra, so they put a bounty on cobras. If you brought dead cobras, you could turn them in for money. Well, it turned out people were raising, nurturing cobras because they wanted the bounty. Um, Eliminating the SAT or ACT, making it optional, has actually served to make universities more selective. Now, it's not made them better, and um, it's in fact caused some problems. Uh, but it has meant more students who wouldn't have applied to a selective university like UCLA or Berkeley or Harvard or Yale ended up applying because they were under the impression that the SAT and ACT were optional, or in the case of the UCs, had no bearing on admission. In the case of the UCs, they're correct. The UCs, since 2020, have not considered the SAT. What that means is that test blind admissions in the UCs have meant 40,000 additional applicants to UCLA. That means UCLA rejects, because they can't accept more, just accepting a different group. They're rejecting many more people and now have 150,000 or roughly total first year applicants. I want you to consider Wellesley is one of the finest liberal arts colleges in the country. Um, it is ranked very highly on the liberal arts rankings. They had the most apps they've ever received last year, 8,900. Yale had the most they've ever received at 57,000. UCLA got 150,000. UCLA, in the way that we rank universities, instantly got better because they reject another 40,000 um, students. In fact, UC Berkeley and UCLA are now both tied for 15. They were five, six, seven spots lower. Admissions people are rewarded for these metrics. Absolutely. I've spoken to more than 100, especially when they leave their post. They're very frank about it. In fact, at a NACAT conference, I once remember a UPenn admissions person making a kind of heartfelt complaint. His complaint was, my dean every year comes into this room of us and says, all right, um, we want test scores to go up on average because that's one of the mechanisms that compares us to Columbia and Yale. But then he said we also want diversity to improve. He basically said you kind of got to pick one of those. Parents, students, and counselors, in my experience, have assumed that the UC system simply wanted different markers of merit. They wanted something else other than testing, but they don't understand. Their own research said testing was tremendously useful and fair. So a lot of families believe somehow that AP scores will be more important. No, AP scores won't give the UCs what they want, which is their model of diversity and equity. Number of AP classes, if I can take more AP, no. There are colleges that are impressed by taking outside AP classes, but not the UCs. Extracurriculars. Okay, I would point out a study that Stanford did looking at holistic, non-cognitive factors in admission discovered when you look at extracurriculars and summer programs, you're picking the most privileged students. This is even worse than using the mechanisms that we had before. Only pretty well-off kids have the opportunity to do wonderful, amazing things in their summertime. A lot of other kids are working. What about essays? Um, I'll explain why I don't think the UC essays became the key. They're important in one sense, but in another, maybe not. GPA is now almost the only objective measure used by the UCs. I say that because when we ask the UCs, what do you want to tell us about your freshman class? That's the only cognitive factor, the only objective factor. It used to be a whole description of difficult classes, test scores, bands of scores, GPA. Um, GPA is now um, pretty much the only number. And I can tell you why. Because GPA, and very few of my clients understand this, serves this particular interpretation of diversity and equity. Equitable grading is a common practice in many um, high school systems outside of Carmel Valley and Rancho Penasquitos. Equitable grading means you want to find every mechanism to award a student a top grade. What it really means in practice, frankly, is everyone gets A's or nearly so. I met with a student a couple years ago after 2020, and I mean, I meet with hundreds of students. Typically at CCA, at Westview, at Del Norte, if I ask a 10th grader who's taking a bunch of APs how many hours of homework and study they have, the common answer is 3 hours. Um, I asked a young woman who went to a different school, not in those areas, and she was puzzled when I asked her how many hours of homework and study. She had none, she told me. And then she explained in what felt like pretty rehearsed language that homework is inequitable. I will grant different homes have different resources. This is not really a solvable problem. I don't agree that the solution might be no one gets any homework at all. And this girl, when we looked at a PSAT that she took, it offered a lot of evidence that she had never been asked to read, never been asked to write, never been asked to do math at home. This is also this focus on GPA with the UCs is reflecting grade inflation that is not even across the United States. There are high schools where there's what we might call grade deflation, where certain teachers, I don't want to name them, but they're just brutal in their grading. Um, and there are other high schools where the pretty standard grade is an A. I'm not the only person noticing this. The book on the one side is, how people can grade so that everyone, the concept is so everyone is evaluated fairly, but it is meant to make sure that everyone is graded essentially the same. And here's a left-leaning liberal teacher writing an essay in the New York Times. I recommend this essay. And his argument is, as a teacher, if everyone gets an A, kind of no one gets an A, which is almost perfectly borrowed from a character in the movie The Incredibles. Um, uh, the UCs, I would argue, are somewhat cynically exploiting some very idealistic practices. The UCs know that some kids in San Diego County have almost no homework and they have A's, and it's very difficult to get a B. And other kids at CCA, at Westview, at Del Norte, at Torrey Pines, it's almost impossible to have all A's. I've had students with perfect 1600s, perfect 36, winning international awards at CCA. They still have one B. I won't tell you who, but it's in the math department. You know who you are. Um, Here's another example of people wanting to promote equitable grading, but the high schools that are focused on rigor do not practice equitable grading. The UCs know that if they want students who are underrepresented, they can't legally be picking them as individuals based on their ethnicity, but they do know percentages of the groups that they consider underrepresented. And that's the term the UCs use, underrepresented. If they pick more students um, in these areas that have traditionally had lower acceptance rates, they will get the numbers they want in terms of ethnicity. And I need you to keep in mind that the UCs and many American universities um, are practicing a form of diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI, that doesn't really match what even someone who's a kind of classic liberal, never voted for a Republican would have imagined 20, 30 years ago. If diversity meant different people from different backgrounds sharing experiences and perspectives, diversity is a wonderful thing. If equity meant we need to keep in mind that not everyone starts at the same place, at the same starting line, and we need to keep those things in mind, then equity is a very good addition to an older concept of equality or fairness. If inclusion means we want to be mindful of the fact that we might be unconsciously excluding some people. In my office, if someone is wearing a hijab, we do cultural sensitivity training where I explain this person has tried to tell us if they're female, I don't want to shake the hand of someone who's a man. They're not telling us they don't like men. They're not telling us they don't like us. They're telling us something that we should try to be aware of. Those meanings, those definitions of diversity, equity, and inclusion, I'm entirely on board. But in a university setting, sometimes in a high school setting, DEI really means we're going to have quotas. We are going to simply stop admitting people because we want to have an equitable set of outcomes. DEI often means we want to have proportionate outcomes. And the problem with that is um, if you're a student who came from a part of the world, the global South, with a dream of education, you might be in a group where there's too large a proportion who has the same dream. Um, the UCs were already in holistic admission, making some attempt to even things out. But in 2020, the entire world for a couple of years was fixated on um, a pretty extreme version of DEI. And I think some of the ways that the current administration is trying to correct it are also um, oversteps and outrageous. Um, but I would want you to know it's very difficult for me to explain to my clients the extent to which my job to advocate for students is not just to make them stronger and better, but to help families understand competence and merit itself are under suspicion in the last 5 to 10 years. This is a book called The Tyranny of Merit. And it's kind of curious that Daniel Markovits wrote The Meritocracy Trap, and Michael Sandel, a professor, an American professor of philosophy who teaches at Oxford, he says that his book is a bold, brave critique. And what's funny is um, that they each blurb the other's book. But I want to read a sentence, a review of The Tyranny of Merit. First of all, for many people, this is a paradox or oxymoron. The tyranny of merit. Tyranny means an unjust system, and merit means rewarding people for their talents and efforts. I'm going to read what a journalist from the Manchester Guardian said in a glowing review of this book. This philosopher asks why exactly anyone should be rewarded for having the sheer luck to be intelligent or able to work hard. I sometimes have clients, parents who laugh at that, but it's kind of not funny. Um, for most of my clients, their home environment is we value working hard and we value intelligence. They're both something that can be nurtured and improved with effort. When effort itself is under suspicion, um, in a way, you're looking at a cultural trend that is devaluing some cultural inheritances that are generational to the point of 1,000 years in many households. Most of my clients are 1.5 generation new Americans. They are immigrants. They do not believe that hard work is a matter of sheer luck. I'm not even sure how to explain that. Fairness and equity have some overlap, but they're not exactly the same thing. And so I want you to consider the UCs stopped publishing the transparent, data-driven information about who got in 2019. The 2018 statistics were the final breath of that kind of transparent expression of who got in. It used to look like this. If we go down, you can see test scores below GPA, and you can see difficulty of courses, honors, and APs. You can see that it got a little bit harder to get in every year. More people would apply. But I want you to consider what you find in the newest expression of an undergraduate admitted student profile. I have traditionally offered programs and services. We can tutor a student who needs work in a subject. I don't have a pill or drink. I don't have a intellectual Ozempic. We have effort. We have guidance. We can help someone study over the summer and become a better reader, better um, able to understand English grammar, better at math by practicing and reviewing. These things take work and effort like anything. It's why I'm 25 pounds heavier than I was a few years ago. I need more work and effort. I'm not blaming anyone but myself. Um, Now the UC's UCLA has one objective piece of information, incoming GPA. And in another piece of information, UCLA revealed their unweighted median GPA last year was a 4.0. What did the typical student who got into UCLA have as an unweighted GPA? A 4.0. That means the typical student now has no Bs. If you're taking hard classes at Westview, hard classes at CCA, hard classes at Del Norte, There's just not that many students who have no B's. If you're going to push yourself, if you're going to try, you're going to you're going to get a few B's unless you're a truly spectacular student in those schools. The UCs have decided this is a way. We're going to limit the number of students from these schools. As you've seen through the data, the schools that were the strongest and most competitive used to have very strong UC admissions rates. Now, um, the rates have completely inverted. Um, I don't have any summer program where you study really hard, you work diligently, and you can improve on your ethnicity. I just want you to consider geographic origin, ethnicity, um, geographic diversity, school of origin. These are elements of identity. The UCs are privileging these elements. If you look at the San Francisco Chronicle, which I've got some hesitation even bringing it up, they have a they've built a product where you pay them $50 and you can see in a pretty way the data that's for free in the UC Common Data Set. So I want you to consider um, this is um, the UC acceptance rates at high schools in each county. And I want you to consider, I'm showing you page one of 12 pages of San Diego County high schools. The highest admit rates at 71, 65, 61, 58, 57 are not in North County. Um, when we want to find CCA and Westview, Torrey Pines, Bishops, they're on page 10. The only high schools that have lower acceptance rates to the UCs are schools that have fewer than three applicants or admitted. I mean, these are virtual academies. CCA and Westview, if we ask, is it producing leaders? Is it producing kids who write books? Is it producing um, kids who make jazz albums? Is it producing kids who are on the International Math Olympiad team? One year I saw a picture of the International Math Olympiad team. Three of the five students were my students, and they were all CCA students. When you look at Westview, you look at Del Norte, you look at Torrey Pines, these are students who I read about them in national newspapers. They're amazing kids. And they're not only not all white, they're not mostly white, but they are often overrepresented. If your family, if your great grandparents were colonial subjects of the British Empire, you're still, in the eyes of the UCs, overrepresented. Um, these numbers are low and they used to be high. How did the UCs do it? They did it by simply shunting aside almost all traditional measures of merit and using GPA, which in some parts of San Diego has been entirely subjected to ideological shifts like equitable grading. Firsthand accounts of significant changes in the qualifications of incoming first years in the UCs are abundant. I don't want to name names. I don't want to get people in trouble. And I promise you, you can get in trouble. Um, Math professors in UC San Diego have told me there used to be no pre-calc classes offered to the engineering students. Why would an engineering student who's typically expected to have had a calculus or 2 years of calculus, why would they need the second year of algebra? But a math professor at UC San Diego told me around 2021, 2022, a dean came in and said, we got to make 300 seats for students admitted for engineering who've not had not only a lick of calculus, they haven't had pre-calculus. And he thought at first it was a joke. He was puzzled. Um, that same professor told me the next year, a dean came in and said, now you got to make 900 spots. So I want you to consider if your student who's very, very strong and works very hard and has taken 2 years of calculus didn't get into UC San Diego, there are 900 who who did, and the UCs have to reinvent how they're teaching math. I would argue the UCs cynically go up in the ranking because they're rejecting 40,000 more students, but the ones they're getting in many ways are less prepared. And the ones they're rejecting, if you're on this webinar, they are your students often. We still have students do very well in the UCs. Last year, we had someone who got into all of them. Um, but my students who now have to choose between Harvard or Stanford for comp sci and econ double major, they're rejected by Irvine, Davis, Santa Barbara, Berkeley. My students who choose between MIT and Stanford, who win first in the International Science and Engineering Fair, they're rejected by almost all of the UCs. What about the essay? Maybe the essays are important. Since 2020, I would argue they've become less important in the UCs than your zip code. Bad essays can kill your UC hopes. You need to have good essays. Bad essays will harm you. But with a few exceptions, kids who have really sad hardships, the great essays that you used to get kids in, they might get you into Harvard, but not necessarily UC Davis. Here's some admissions math regarding UC essays. UC readers, I know this because I asked my wife, I pleaded, I begged, I bullied her into being a UC reader for a particular UC campus. She told me she was paid $2 per app, and there's about 3,000 words on average in an application. In some instances, there are more. You need to know the average college graduate reads 235 words per minute. That means 4.6 apps in an hour if you don't take a break. That means your hourly wage is one that is illegal in California if you read them. And if you want to make a wage that is even close to what California says is a legal living wage, you can't read the UC essays. If you are a reader, you must skim them. I have not seen a single newspaper take any notice of this. Why? Because they are pretty much on a kind of ideological lockdown. Um, the UCs, I would admit, are probably not using ethnicity, race, gender in a fine-grained individual sense. You need to know this. The argument I'm making is not that the UCs are going through each application and saying, here's an Asian kid. No, thank you. They're instead using proxies for ethnicity. They're now using zip codes and school districts. They're practicing what I'm going to call quiet quotas. This is a long-standing practice in almost every selective university. This tactic is expressly forbidden by the Supreme Court. What cannot be done directly cannot be done indirectly. But UC admissions practices, although they likely violate, I would say, the letter of the law, they definitely violate the spirit of the law. Um, this is from a newspaper story. This young woman's holding up a sign that says, "My race is my story." I have no doubt that for almost everyone, some element of their identity is tied to their ethnic or racial experience. But I would point out, um, if your race is your story, you gotta point out for whom is race not their story. If you're in the UCs and you are Asian American, race is not your story. I have had an Ivy League admissions director tell me, oh, if you're Chinese, don't write about your identity. We don't want to hear about it. Now, he didn't say that publicly. Um, you need to know this model of equity, this model of diversity means San Diego, until about 2 years ago, had a superintendent who, at a DEI event, saw fit to explain um, the concept of DEI in these terms. She said, "We have an influx of Asians from China, and the people who are able to make that journey are wealthy. A large influx of Chinese families moving in, sight unseen, into our homes, into the community, and that requires money." She said, essentially, if you see a Chinese kid and he's doing well, they came from China with millions of dollars. She sounds a lot like someone I'm not a fan of who said this about other immigrants. Oh, they're coming into our country. Immigrants, I mean, look at the leadership of our entire technology sector and tell me you think the United States can get along without immigration. But this person is saying some of these people, they don't really belong here. Now, to be fair, students organized, and this person is no longer the superintendent of the San Diego School District. I'm proud to tell you the student who started the change.org petition was my student. I'm also happy to tell you she's at Stanford. Um, I want you to consider the cost of some of these ways of thinking about identity and race and admissions. Um, in the 1980s, a man who was Chinese, but in Detroit, two people thought he was Japanese. He was murdered violently. A student was stabbed on a bus just a few years ago. Um, in Indiana University. Um, if we look at headlines from the last couple of years, if we think about laws in California, um, um, if we think about um, the alien land laws, if we think about the Chinese Exclusion Act, if we think about these headlines, we should probably pause before we build an admission system in the UCs that is purposefully designed to exclude. And then we have the gall to use the word inclusive. We should think about the talent we're pushing out the door, sending in my world to Purdue, to Illinois, to Wisconsin. Those are great schools, um, but they're expensive if you don't pay taxes in Wisconsin or Indiana or Michigan. Two scholars, one, Jerome Karabel, is a professor of sociology at Berkeley, and another, Nicholas Lemon, a New Yorker writer. They've written books that I highly recommend. The one on the left is super academic. The one on the right is more fast-paced. They tell the story of how admissions in the United States has almost always been anxious about certain immigrants being too prevalent in top schools. The stories both of these books tell are worries about Eastern European immigrants, which was the term of art um, for people who are Jewish. I'm going to show you a letter. It's kind of famous. I'm going to read you a little piece of it. This was written in the 1970s, but it's going back to admissions practices that were decades earlier. I asked how many Jews there were in Princeton, Mr. Hibben said. About 200. I said, how many were there last year? About 200. I asked, that's very odd. How did that happen? Every year, 200. He said he didn't know. It just happened. Mrs. Hibben was outraged and said, Jack Hibben, I don't see how you can sit there and lie to this young man. You know very well that you and Dean Eisenhart get together every year and fix the quota. Um, Caitlin Flanagan, a writer for The Atlantic. The Atlantic, this is not Fox News. I highly recommend you dig into this article. Her point is basically to follow the dictates of so-called anti-racism, you've got to continue a more than 100-year legacy of racism against Asian immigrants because the argument is they're taking spots that other people should have. Um, the UCs are not honest actors in this world. Just a year or two ago, I asked UC Irvine, what are your impacted majors? Very useful question. Impacted majors have lower acceptance rates. But UC Irvine wants additional applicants so badly because they'll go up in the ranking when they reject more that their answer is good news. UC Irvine doesn't have any impacted majors. And then they go on to say nursing, computer science, and business administration, which are impacted majors, are the most highly selected majors. You're dealing with the UCs with a group that feels like they don't really have to tell you the truth, which is why we sometimes have courts and trials. I'm going to show you not that I want to pick on this company. I don't know much about it, but I want you to consider if a company is telling you we've got former UC admission people who are going to tell you how to get in. If they are honest, they will tell you what I tell people, which is Your essay probably won't be read. It will be skimmed. You should know when someone who is so amazing in their application and essays that they get into all the Ivies and they're rejected by all the UCs. It wasn't that they weren't a good applicant or that they weren't a good writer or they didn't have anything to say. They are a victim of a quiet quota. So I'm just kind of aghast that there are people who used to make a modest living in admissions at the UCs. Now they make a much better living. They're not honest. This is a dishonest practice. Here's the San Francisco Chronicle. This is a newspaper that's supposed to be reporting their understanding of the truth. Look at this headline. What GPA is needed to get into UCLA and UC Berkeley? Here's the data explained. I mean, this is like, how many legs do you need to compete in the Olympic marathon? Well, the typical answer is two, but that's not really going to get you there. What GPA is needed? This is the reporter for education for the San Francisco Chronicle. Um, Other people are going to tell you that they have a secret. What I'm telling people is um, you need to apply to other schools as well as have great applications to the UCs because if you're good enough, I might be able to get you into Stanford and MIT, but who knows about Riverside? A company, I'm not picking on it, a company started by a South Asian immigrant wanted to explain, American admissions to people who were newly arrived from India or Pakistan or countries in that orbit. Um, and you can tell this person who, again, I don't not picking on this guy. This guy had good intentions. He must have thought, okay, if there's no SATs, I'll build a company that focuses on the essay. But he didn't know enough to know the essays aren't going to get you past a system that's designed to keep out certain types of students. By the way, this company doesn't exist anymore. Turns out you can't tell people it's easy to get into the UCs and then have to admit it's easier to get a job at Google than to get into Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. Uh, Again, I don't know why I have this guy here. Just he says the best SAT, ACT prep in the world. His argument is he's had 7 students get perfect SATs. All right, this is 217, and it's not even up to date. I just would say I'm not entirely sure why other people aren't putting these pieces together, but you have to be careful. Um, you can't just read a newspaper. You've got to read all of them and read them against the grain. How do we know that the UCs are engaging in discrimination based on race, ethnicity? Is there a smoking gun, a whistleblower? Not yet, but there could be because in these trials, um, the discovery process is infinitely different now than it was 30 years ago with texts and Slack and emails. Um, what is now mostly circumstantial evidence may indeed turn into a different type of evidence. But I want you to consider something that Henry David Thoreau said about circumstantial evidence. In the middle of the 19th century, there was a dairy in the Northeast that um, was found to have diluted milk with water from a local creek. You can make more money. Um, and Henry David Thoreau said this. It's become kind of a famous saying, and I want you to think about it tonight. He said, some circumstantial evidence is very strong, as when you find a trout in the milk. Okay, you didn't have to witness them diluting the milk with creek water, but if you find a trout in it, it is circumstantial evidence, but it's pretty strong. Um, I would say regarding the UCs, there's a trout in the milk. Another saying, um, someone who grew up in the Midwest, I heard it growing up, when a pig becomes a hog, it gets slaughtered. This is not a call to violence. You should be polite to anyone working with the UCs. You shouldn't even call them names. Um, this is a legal concept. When a pig becomes a hog, it gets slaughtered. It means when something becomes so egregious, that is when it is targeted. That is when people can't tolerate it. So I want you to consider This data that Del Norte is now 11% acceptance rate. And it's not just the percentage. Far fewer students are being accepted. It's not that the same number is, it's just more applicants. Fewer students are accepted, fewer will go. This is the trout in the milk. A Bay Area teenager rejected by nearly all colleges except one or two out of state that are state colleges, not his own state, who works for Google. This is a trout in the milk. What should you do? I have many solutions, but that's not what tonight is about. I'm not trying to tell you my solutions. I'm very proud that our students do very well. Um, Again, I mean, this year we had acceptances early to nearly every dream college you can think of, and more are coming in. In this case, I'm going to tell you though, the solution isn't to come to me necessarily and be my client. The solution to this problem is to organize, to do something that has a fraught history for many Asian Americans. Many escaped a part of the world where political violence was a reality, and they learned some lessons like keep your head down. The nail that sticks out gets pounded down. But I want to remind you, a young woman 2 years ago who saw something that wasn't right, that wasn't just, um, ended up changing the leadership in the San Diego Union District. It took effort, it took courage. I'm very proud of her. I'm going to suggest to you the governor, the governor names the regents, and the regents have ignored empirical evidence and they simply don't care about your kids. I would urge you to make them care. Um, that's going to be the real solution. Um, I will try to do my best to look at comments and questions. Um, I want to remind everyone. Okay, so I'll look at some questions right now. Do the top 25% of the class still get guaranteed admission? No, they don't. They have a similar sounding policy, but no, there's no guarantee. The guarantee is they'll look again. And by the way, when they look again, because you got rejected everywhere, they will typically make a spot for you at Merced. They do not have that guarantee. Does the slide showing the breakdown of Latinos, Blacks, and Whites include the ratio of Asians? Um, I do not know. I'd have to look at that compared to whites. I don't know. And frankly, I honestly don't care. What I care about is have the UCs dismantled a system that used traditional notions of merit and competence and excellence alongside human conditions of hardship and challenge, and even issues of diversity by race and ethnicity. Did they take that system that they built in '06 and dismantle it in 2020 because there was a fever for a different, more radical notion of equity? Yes. And should they be honest about it? Yes. About those ratios, I don't know. Someone says a lot of top schools are starting to reuse SAT, ACT, and determining admissions. Since the UCs won't, at least through 2025, do you see them possibly reallowing it? Like, I do see them possibly reallowing it. I will tell you this. They think they're right. They have moral certainty. They will have to be forced. But I think um, it's complicated. I'd have to go into the history of the lawsuit that was the proximal cause of it. But yes, I do see it. I do see it coming back. Um, the solution is someone says it's pretty hopeless. For the UCs, it's not hopeless because I mean we still get a lot of kids into the UCs. I just can't predict which ones they'll be. And if it was life or death, if you had to get into UCLA, someone's being held prisoner, someone is kidnapped. If you don't get into UCLA, uh, they'll die. Then I would say make up a terrible hardship because my students who do have profound hardships, it cuts through that. I also would say my job is to sell students to university, but not to sell their souls. I don't want students doing what the UCs are doing. The UCs are not honest. They are lying. The solution isn't to also lie. That cynicism I want nothing to do with. It's not hopeless. partly because there are other universities that are on par. The question is, can you pay for them? If you can go just to tick down, good scores and good grades mean merit money. I just sat down with a young woman who's attending a top tier, bottom of the top tier liberal arts college. And her dad said, I asked her, well, you got into these other bigger schools. They didn't give you the merit money. This one did. Are you happy? Her answer was, she's 100% happy and thriving. And by the way, she's getting a 3.8 something, and she's probably going to go to med school. Um, when you say do the opposite of UCs, I'm not sure what this person means. I would say um, Ivies, unlike the UCs, do not ignore extraordinary examples of impact and insight in the application. Ivies used to accept those students who had extraordinary impact and insight. And of course, they were getting into the UCs. Now the Ivies look at someone and say, this is a future, this is a current leader in culture. And the UCs say, this is another kid from 92127. This is another kid from 92130. Um, I think summer programs by the UC, some of them are very good programs. They are good. There's no real evidence that they favor kids in these zip codes for attending. Um, Someone is asking a question about yield rate, and I don't want to put words in their mouth, but the only words I have is it also because of yield rate? Yield is the idea that um, it's a factor that is that's considered by US News. Yield is the percentage of students who are offered a spot who agree to go. So there is some evidence despite their disavowing it. Again, they're liars. Some of the UCs practice yield protection. They will say no to someone who's just so good, they just wouldn't come. I saw that starting 10 years ago at Davis. Davis got a new admissions director. He came from Berkeley and he wanted to show off and probably get a promotion. He started engaging in yield protection. I saw it right away. The UCs say they don't, but they do. But here's the thing. You can't explain most of these profound examples with yield protection. Why would a why would Riverside say yes, you're accepted to someone who wins International Science and Engineering Fair for computer science, but tell her you're not accepted for computer science, but accepted for neuroscience? That's not yield protection. That's that's something else. Um, uh, yeah, someone says, what about moving to a different zip code? Well, you'll have a different experience and different peers, and the schools that surround us, they're among the best in the world. And the families and the students are among the best you'll ever encounter. They are creating and building and making. Um, my first task is to make people aware of this, to know something that you might not have known before. I will try to put links on our website or make links available. Um, you can't use historical data, though, if it goes back before 2020, as I've seen. The acceptance rates just completely reversed. Students can set themselves apart in many important ways, but the UCs are not um, very interested in that. You just need to know that. Um, Someone asked this excellent question. Do the UCs use AI to screen the applications? I don't know. I don't know. Um, I can't answer questions of should you move. I will tell people if you're in a school district and you have worries about your student being overwhelmed by the rigor um, of CCA, of Del Norte, of Westview, you may want to consider moving to a school in your district that is less rigorous. For some people, that might be a mistake. They'll lose some of the resources and opportunities. But you should know the UCs are somewhat cynically using a few Bs as an excuse um, to get the numbers where they want. Um, some people are asking me questions about what's happening here. What's happening is volatility. The UCs will get what they want, proportional representation geographically by randomness. So if you're wondering, gosh, the results seem random. Um, yeah, a little bit. Um, They're also wanting people who got perfect A's and had great scores to now transfer through community college. But I will warn you, if everyone chooses that path, which is pretty inefficient for some of our students, and they will have no real freshman year experience, if everyone chooses it, it won't be an easy path. Um, um, I'm looking at other questions, and I don't want to keep people any longer. Um, Again, most of these questions, they still underneath assume they're looking for notions of merit and competence, just different ones. No, they're not. They're not looking at that right now. Um, when this breaks, when there's hard evidence of what the UCs are doing, this is going to be like the varsity blues. Um, and someone says, yes, the UCs are basically looking at GPA, but even a perfect GPA, a bad GPA will keep you out. A perfect GPA may not get you in. A perfect GPA for other top tier schools might not only get you in, but might get you a merit scholarship. Um, um, I don't know if the UCs and CSUs can identify if they've been written by the help of AI, but I can tell you this. I can identify when they've been written by AI, and pardon me, but they suck. If your kid is letting AI write his essays, that's a fail. Um, um, it's good enough to write something that might get you um, a decent grade in a high school class, might not, depending on your teacher. But no, it can't do yet what you need. Um, I'm gonna let me see. Someone has a raised hand. Um, I'm gonna thank everyone for your time, and um, I'm not it's not hopeless, but the first step is to understand what is the reality, what's happening. It's past the point of wishful thinking and fantastical beliefs. You need to see things clearly. I'm going to work on trying to make a tighter, more focused version of this presentation. And there are risks. I have students who do not want to be identified in any of this, even though they agree with me. And maybe in another moment, I'll tell you some of the personal travails I've experienced. I used to work with and donate to two schools in Poway Unified, but I had a mom about a year ago ask me in a SAT information session why my office isn't in South San Diego. I should have asked her, why is she not in South San Diego? And the next thing I know, I'm not working with these two schools that I have in the past donated a couple $100,000 to. My understanding is the Poway Unified District um, it needs this information, and frankly, they could use the money, but mostly they could use um, truthful, accurate information. And I was honestly just talking about the SAT. I wasn't talking about any of these things. This is a fairly controversial conversation, but um, and again, I hope that one version of overreaction and stupid on the right doesn't replace the version on the left that I've been troubled by. I'm worried that we might be seeing that. But I do know if we want to make anything better, we got to first understand what is the nature of the situation? What is the nature of the problem? I'm very proud of the students and families I work with, and I'm hoping that someday the strongest California students who contribute in high school so much will be represented again in the strongest California public universities. Um, one that I taught in for many, many years. Um, no, and someone is saying it's not helpless. I assume in this case they probably mean hopeless. Um, no, it is not. There are there are room, there's room for your awesome, amazing student all over the United States. I just think there should be room for them in the university system that your taxes are supporting. Um, and I don't even want to pick on, I mean, Poway and San Diego, they're rigorous um, teachers I'm not sure you want to change that, though. I think you just want to reward um, effort, work, intelligence, rigor, rather than punishing it. Um, um, I I don't think we want to live in a world where we have no consideration of people's ethnicity, race, background, hardships. In fact, the UCs had an excellent system that they had already built. They just they just got a bit swept up, and we have a system where um, there are some mechanisms to at least call to account some of these practices. I see someone has a comment here, and I just will tell you I don't want to identify them, but their student had some kind of challenges, but their student on his own, I wish I could say I helped, but on his own studied the SAT, got an awesome score. I did help with the application process because how in the world will a smart teenager know what Harvard and other schools want? But I just want you to know that student um, is at Harvard, and no one should feel hopeless, but we should be mindful of um, honestly ways we make the world better, but also more fair. And I think there's a fundamental problem with fairness. I'm going to thank everyone and apologize for taking so much of your time. Um, um, I'll do my best to answer other questions. Um, I appreciate everyone's participation. Thank you.